Did you know that in the 19th century, some women were forced to give birth while still chained to prison walls? What happens when a newborn takes its first breath in the same air thick with rot, mold, and human despair? And here's the cruelest question of all. How does a society measure justice when it strips away the dignity of even a mother in labor? This is not a story of medicine or mercy. It is a story of punishment carried into the most vulnerable moment of life. Stay with me until the end, because every detail reveals how power once claimed not just bodies, but the very act of giving life. Imagine a world where being a woman already meant carrying a heavy weight of expectation. Now, imagine being a woman in the 19th century, behind bars, with a child growing inside you. For many of these women, prison was not just a sentence, it was a slow erasure of their humanity. Pregnancy, which should have been a moment of anticipation and care, became another punishment layered on top of confinement. Historical records show us glimpses. Women entering prison already expecting, or becoming pregnant inside, often through circumstances we can only guess at. Some were accused of theft, others condemned for debts, and some were simply swept into the system because they had no protection. Whatever the reason, once inside, the fact that a new life was coming into the world meant very little to those who guarded the keys. And here is where the hidden struggle begins. Prison systems of the 19th century were not built for compassion. They were built for control, for order, for the breaking down of spirit. So, what chance did an unborn child have? What chance did a mother have to feel safe? When I think about this, it feels personal because at its core, it is a story about dignity. A story about what it means to be treated as less than human at the very moment when humanity is needed most. It is one thing to take away someone's freedom, but it is another to take away the small, fragile hope of motherhood. And this is only the beginning. Because once the first cries of labor echoed through those stone walls, the true horror of birth in prison would be revealed. Let's step behind those doors together, into the world where new life began not in warmth, but in the cold shadow of iron bars. Now, picture the moment of labor beginning inside those prison walls. No clean sheets, no midwife to guide the mother through the waves of pain. Instead, a damp cell with straw scattered on the floor, already soiled by days of use, became the delivery room. The walls sweated with mold, the air thick with the smell of iron, sweat, and despair. Some women were forced to give birth in chains, their ankles bound, guards standing just a few feet away. Others were left alone, their cries echoing through the corridors, while the guards turned their backs as if birth were an inconvenience, not a sacred moment. And still, life pushed its way forward. Babies were born into the dark, often greeted not by a mother's gentle touch, but by the chill of stone and the indifference of authority. I can't help but think about the silence that must have followed those first cries. No lullaby, no warm cloth to wrap a newborn, only the sound of dripping water from the ceiling and the heavy slam of prison doors. In a world outside, neighbors might have gathered to help a new mother, offering broth, comfort, or simply kind words. But here, in prison, compassion was as rare as sunlight. These conditions were more than unsanitary, they were cruel. Many mothers suffered infections. Many infants never lived beyond their first days. And what strikes me most is not just the physical danger, but the emotional weight. To bring a child into such a place must have felt like handing them over to fate before they even had a chance to live. But perhaps the most haunting part is this. These women were not only denied safety, they were denied recognition as mothers. Behind bars, childbirth was stripped of its tenderness and turned into another form of punishment. And yet, there were stories, whispered accounts, of women who fought to cradle their babies even for a brief moment, refusing to let the system erase their bond. That resistance, small as it was, is what lingers with me. Because the question isn't just how these women gave birth, it's what happened next. How were those fragile infants treated once the prison had claimed their mothers? That is where the story turns even darker. And where we must go next. If the act of giving birth inside a prison cell was cruel, what followed could be even harsher. For many mothers, the moment they held their child was painfully brief. Some infants were taken almost immediately, handed to orphanages or left in overcrowded institutions where survival was uncertain. Others stayed with their mothers in the cell for a time, but those dark walls offered little protection to a newborn's fragile body. I sometimes picture a young woman, Let's call her Margaret, clutching her baby close, wrapping it in the corner of her thin blanket, whispering promises of love that she knew she could not keep. Perhaps she counted the tiny breaths, terrified that each one might be the last. These details may be imagined, but they echo the fragments of real accounts left behind. Women begged guards for clean water, pleaded for mercy, and prayed that someone, anyone, would see them not as criminals but as mothers. What lingers most for me is not only the absence of care, but the deliberate absence of compassion. A mother's cry was treated as noise, a child's cry as nuisance. In some prisons, women were forced back to labor, the kind of labor with shackles and sweat, just days after giving birth. Their bodies still raw, their arms empty. Can you imagine the hollow ache of that silence? Knowing your child was gone, but not knowing if they were safe or even alive. And yet, even in such hopelessness, there were flashes of resistance. Some women fought to keep their babies with them, hiding scraps of food to feed them, using their own bodies as shields against the cold. These moments remind me that even when institutions stripped everything away, freedom, dignity, safety, the instinct to protect, to nurture, remained unbroken. But in the broader story of the 19th century, these mothers and infants were forgotten. Their names rarely appeared in records. Their lives, often cut short, dissolved into statistics. And that silence is its own kind of injustice. As I reflect on it, I can't escape the question, why did society allow this? Why was motherhood, the most human of experiences, turned into another form of humiliation and punishment? To answer that, we need to look not just at the prisons, but at the society that built them, and what those power structures valued most. That is where our story leads next. So why was all this allowed to happen? Why did the world outside those prison walls look away? The answer lies in the way 19th century society understood power and punishment. Women in prison were not seen as mothers or daughters, but as fallen figures, people stripped of respectability, and with it, their right to compassion. Once a woman was labeled a criminal, the idea that she might still deserve dignity, especially in childbirth, was erased. The silence of society was not an accident. It was a choice. Courts, governments, even churches often believed that punishment should be total, reaching not just the body of the prisoner but her spirit. And childbirth, that most vulnerable moment, became another tool to remind her that she belonged to the system, not to herself. In a way, prisons used humiliation as a kind of secondary sentence, one that extended beyond the crime itself. I think about how differently it might have been if people outside those walls had spoken up. But for the most part, they didn't. Ordinary citizens accepted that suffering was part of justice. Some even believed that hardship in childbirth was a fitting lesson for women who had disobeyed. It's painful to admit, but power structures thrive not only because of those who enforce them, but also because of those who remain silent. This is the part of the story that feels the most haunting to me, not just the chains, not just the filth, but the collective shrug of a society that could have cared, but chose not to. And when silence becomes normal, cruelty becomes invisible. Yet history has a way of circling back. The question we are left with is not only what happened then, but what echoes remain now. And to answer that, we must look at what these forgotten stories reveal about our world today, and about the lessons we carry forward. When we look back at these stories, it's easy to think they belong to another world, distant, sealed away in the 19th century. But the truth is, their echoes are still with us. Around the globe, there are still prisons where women give birth without proper care, where dignity is not guaranteed, and where silence allows injustice to persist. For me, the most unsettling lesson is this: cruelty doesn't survive just because of laws or walls. It survives because people convince themselves not to look too closely. And when I hear about women chained during labor even in recent decades, I can't help but see the shadow of those 19th century cells stretching across time. I also think about what these stories reveal about resilience. Even in the darkest places, women tried to hold on to tenderness, to cradle their infants, to resist being reduced to nothing more than their crimes. That small act of love, even in chains, is proof of a strength that no system could erase. So what do we take from this? For me, it is a reminder that justice cannot just be about punishment. It has to be about dignity. It has to recognize the humanity of even those who have stumbled, even those who have fallen. Because the measure of a society is not how it treats its strongest, but how it treats its most vulnerable. And perhaps that is why these forgotten voices matter so much. They ask us to look closer, to remember, and to refuse silence. Because once we acknowledge the past, we can begin to ask the harder question: what will we do differently now? Stay with me as we continue to uncover more of these hidden histories, stories that don't just tell us about the past, but challenge us to think about the world we are shaping today.